Now we've talked about an action potential and how neurons are able to send a signal down the axon. Now we need to look at what happens when you get to the end of one axon and you need to send the signal down the next neuron. And this is where the term synapse comes from. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about muscles and muscle stimulation, and so hopefully this will sound familiar, because at the end of a neuron you have something called a synapse. And this is what connects two neurons together. So just like in the muscle cells, when you had a neuron coming up to the muscle cell to stimulate it, that neuron didn't ever quite touch the muscle cell. There's a tiny space there, and we call that a synapse. This is the same thing when you go from one neuron to the next. Two neurons don't actually touch. They get really close, and they have this little tiny space called a synapse. And so as the signal is moving down the neuron, it's an electrical signal, it's an action potential, as we saw. When you get to this little space, though, you can no longer send an electrical impulse. You have to change to a chemical impulse, and then once it gets that impulse, or that stimulus gets to the next neuron, then it'll continue as an electrical impulse. So here's a picture of two neurons next to each other. So here's our first cell body, here's our axon. Notice how it's myelinated. Notice the nodes of Ranvier. And then here's our second neuron with its axon, and then you have your dendrites sticking out on this side. So this neuron is sending a signal down, and then its axon synapses with these dendrites in the next neuron, which signals this next neuron, which will then send a signal down its axon. And so what this picture is showing here, this is showing the end of one of the axons, the end of the axon of the first neuron, and then this is the dendrite, or the cell body of that second nerve. And here is that little space, so they don't actually touch. So we have an electrical signal coming down here. It comes to the end of the axon, and this electrical signal can't jump across this little space here. So now we're going to change into a chemical signal using what's called neurotransmitters to stimulate this next nerve and continue the signal along. Okay, this little space is called the synaptic cleft, where the two come together. So what happens is, in the axon here, we have these little vesicles, and these vesicles are full of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter we talked about before was acetylcholine, and that's one that is commonly used in the nervous system. And so this acetylcholine, these vesicles full of acetylcholine, as that action potential, as that signal comes down the neuron, down the axon, it's going to signal these vesicles to move to the edge of the synaptic cleft, to the edge of the plasma membrane of the axon, and release their contents out into the synaptic cleft. So these are little chemicals, little molecules. Here we have our vesicle, it's coming up to the synaptic cleft, fusing with the synaptic cleft, and all these little acetylcholine molecules are moving out into this space. On the receiving neuron, we have these little channels, receptors, that pick up the acetylcholine. And it acts as a little trigger, as a little key to open up these channels. So acetylcholine is going to come out. These ion channels will pick up that acetylcholine, and what that's going to do is it's going to open up the channels, and when those channels are open, that's going to allow the ions to move inside the receiving neuron. So similar to what was happening before, in an action potential, the sodium ions on the outside of the cell are going to move to the inside of the cell, but in this case it's going to be triggered by the neurotransmitter. So here we can see a close-up of our channel, and this is a sodium channel. Here we have our neurotransmitter, our acetylcholine attaching to this channel here. So this is a blow up of these little purple guys. And then the sodium is going to be allowed to move down its concentration gradient. So just like in the axon, there's a lot of sodium on the outside in the synaptic cleft wanting to get in because there's not very much sodium inside. So by opening this gate, it's going to go rushing in, and that's going to cause a depolarization. If the signal is strong enough, then that's going to cause an action potential in the neuron that is picking up this signal, and then we're going to have a propagation of the signal that came from the last neuron. If it's not strong enough, then it's not going to stimulate an action potential. What happens after that is after the sodium's been allowed in, this acetylcholine or the neurotransmitter is going to be broken down by an enzyme, so it's going to be released from the channel, and then it's going to be in that synaptic cleft. It's going to be reabsorbed by the other neuron, by the axon here, and it's going to be rebuilt into the neurotransmitter so that it can be used again when the next signal comes down. At this point, sodium can no longer go in. So again, if the depolarization occurred, then this signal was sent down the next neuron. If it wasn't, then you got to wait for another signal to come and see if it was strong enough to propagate this signal. So again, this is very similar to the synaptic cleft or the synapse that we saw at the muscle cell. The same sort of thing is happening. The same system happens between neurons as well. I want to take a few minutes and talk about a reflex as well. So we're all familiar with reflexes. This is when you go into the doctor, they take out that little hammer and hit your knee, and your leg or your arm or wherever they hit is suddenly does this little jerky movement that you don't really control. This is what we call a reflex, and it is automatic. We don't have to think about it. And so we're going to look at something called a reflex arc and how this happens. Because in a reflex, you have a stimulus coming in, such as the hammer hitting, and that means you're sending a signal down the afferent neuron towards the central nervous system. And it gets to the central nervous system, but it doesn't have to go clear up to the brain to be processed. This is kind of a short circuit that it's hardwired what is going to happen when you hit this reflex arc. So for example, let's say you get a needle or a nail in your skin. So you've got these little neuron receptors here. The pain receptors are going to be stimulated, and so this is going to send a signal down the afferent neuron. So notice here's our cell body. Remember, the afferent neurons, the cell body is always outside the central nervous system in a little ganglion. And then here is our spinal cord, our central nervous system. So the afferent neuron is going to bring the signal into the central nervous system, and then we have the interneuron here. So at this point, a signal can go up to the brain, but in a reflex, it's going to stay right here in the spinal cord because it's already decided what's going to happen. So this is where the decision is made, but there's not really a decision. Sent down this interneuron, and immediately a signal is sent back down the motor neuron. So the motor neuron cell body is in the central nervous system. Then you have your axon coming out, and that's going to stimulate your muscle around the skin. So say this was in your arm, then your muscle in your arm is going to react. It's going to, for example, it may jerk away from the needle or the nail or whatever that it is that's stuck in it. And this again is an automatic reflex that happens. So it doesn't have to go up to the brain to be processed, it just happens immediately. Here's two examples of reflex arcs. One is a little simpler than the other. Okay, in the leg muscle, when the doctor hits your knee with that hammer, sending a signal, you've got your ganglion, it's going. Notice here there's no interneuron. So we go into spinal cord, and immediately we synapse with the efferent neuron, and so it goes to your leg, and your leg is going to kick. Your muscles contract, causing you to kick. In this reflex arc here, we have the neuron going into the spinal cord, but then we do have an interneuron connecting the afferent and the efferent neurons, but you're still getting a similar type reaction. This system here has only 2 neurons. This system here has 3 neurons. This second stimulus here will actually be slower than the first reflex. And this isn't necessarily a lot of time. This isn't something that we'd necessarily recognize. But when we're talking about neurons, I just wanted to point out that when we're talking about neurons, the limiting factor is how many neurons there are. Because an electrical signal is very fast. It takes milliseconds, almost instantaneous. So when you receive the stimulus, this signal is moving up this neuron and down this neuron. But the limiting factor comes where they connect to each other. Because remember, that is not an electrical stimulus. When this axon synapses with the next axon, the cell body of the next neuron, we have to send a chemical signal. Chemical signal is going to be a little bit slower than the electrical signal. So in this case where we have one neuron, so we have one synapse, second neuron, the second synapse, and then we have the efferent neuron, we have to send 2 chemical signals, right there and right there. And so again, it's going to be very, very slight difference, not a difference that we could even notice, but because of this extra neuron in here, this reflex is going to take slightly longer than the other one. The examples we just looked at are what we'd call somatic reflexes. Somatic meaning this is our voluntary system, mainly our muscles, our skeletal muscles, and so these reflexes would be the ones that we just talked about, where your skeletal muscles are contracting. But we also have autonomic reflexes. So the autonomic system is a system that is involuntary, and so for example, the regulation of smooth muscles, your digestive tract, your arteries and things like that, heart and blood pressure, glands, their regulation, all of these things are also reflexes. So we don't have to process them, our brain doesn't have to think about them, they automatically happen depending on the stimuli that they're receiving in the system. To end this section, let's talk a little bit about the subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system. So there's 2 large divisions. There's a sensory division, then there's the motor division. We're just going to look right now at the motor subdivision. The sensory subdivision, that's just basically what it is. It's the afferent pathway. We're going to look at the efferent pathway, and this is where it splits up into a lot of different categories. In the motor subdivision, or the efferent subdivision of the peripheral nervous system, there's 2 main categories. There is the somatic and the autonomic. And the somatic, this is generally voluntary. This is the skeletal muscles. The autonomic is the involuntary system. This is the cardiac and smooth muscles. And the autonomic is the one that has the 2 subdivisions, the sympathetic, or fight and flight, and then parasympathetic, which sometimes is known as the rest and digest systems. So there's some differences between the somatic and the autonomic, the voluntary and involuntary systems. First of all, there's the nerves. In the somatic system, there's always one motor neuron, meaning that it goes clear from the CNS clear to the skeletal muscle that is stimulating. In the autonomic, you have a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron. The organs they affect are also different. Somatic, or the voluntary, is the skeletal muscle. The autonomic is smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And then also the neurotransmitters are different. So when you come to a synapse in the somatic system, the neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine. And again, we've seen that as we've looked at the skeletal muscle. That's the one we looked at between the synapse between nerves and skeletal muscle. Autonomic system, there's some different possibilities here. You could have acetylcholine is used as a neurotransmitter, but also something called epinephrine and norepinephrine, which you've probably heard about before. Epinephrine, another name for epinephrine, is adrenaline. Alright, so here's a little diagram from your chart, from your book, that shows some of the differences. It writes them out here. So here we have the somatic system. Here we have one neuron, and then we have the acetylcholine at the synapse, and it's going to skeletal muscle. Notice how it's all myelinated here. Okay, then you have the autonomic nervous system. So this is the other major division in the motor or the efferent system of the peripheral nervous system. we have the sympathetic, or the fight or flight section here. And here we have two neurons. We have the preganglionic and the postganglionic. And remember, ganglion is formed by these cell bodies. So the second neuron here is found, the cell body is found in this ganglion. The first synapse is always going to be acetylcholine. The second synapse is going to be norepinephrine, in this case, going to the smooth muscle. Also, the sympathetic division can affect the glands. And so we have a neuron coming here with acetylcholine, and now we have epinephrine and norepinephrine being released into the blood vessels, which will go and stimulate glands inside our body. In the parasympathetic division, we have the two neurons and the ganglion, the preganglionic and the postganglionic, but the neurotransmitter is only going to be acetylcholine in both places and affecting smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands as well. So that shows some of the differences between these systems. There are a few differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic within the autonomic nervous system. So again, these have the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons, but in the parasympathetic, the preganglionic neuron is very long. The postganglionic is very short. That means that the ganglion is near the organ that is being affected by the parasympathetic system. Sympathetic system is opposite. So you have a shorter preganglionic neuron and a very long postganglionic neuron, so that the ganglion are closer to the central nervous system, closer to the spinal cord. Okay, the sympathetic also, where it leaves the spinal cord, is different. So it's between T1, the vertebra T1 to L2. The parasympathetic comes out up above from the brain stem, but then also through from S1 and S4 clear down to the bottom. So parasympathetic comes out of the top, the bottom of the spinal cord, and then the sympathetic comes out in between. Okay, the sympathetic only can use epinephrine or norepinephrine as neurotransmitters. The parasympathetic only uses acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. The sympathetic system is known as our fight or flight. And this is what takes over when you get scared, or when you when you're stressed out. And so things like exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment, all of these things are going to stimulate this parasympathetic. And again, remember, this is autonomic, so this is involuntary. These are involuntary stimuli that you receive. So when you may get scared and suddenly you break out in a sweat, your hair stands up, your pupils are going to dilate, and all these things are going to happen without your control as you're deciding what to do in this situation. The parasympathetic is the rest and digest, or as they say here, the housekeeping activities. And this is what's going to happen when this is the system that takes over when, for example, you're resting, you're not excited. You're going to start digesting. You're going to carry out your normal body functions. Okay, so these two systems kind of work in conjunction, so they're antagonists of each other. So the sympathetic is going to stimulate a number of organs, and whereas the parasympathetic system is going to slow down some organs. So for example, where the sympathetic system is going to excite your heart's going to beat faster, your lungs are going to start working harder. The parasympathetic is going to slow your heart down, it's going to help you to rest, and then the digestive organs are going to be stimulated. The sympathetic system, when you get excited, your body's going to turn off your digestive organs, or at least minimize the amount of energy and blood that's moving to your digestive system, so you'll have all the energy you need to react to the emergency situation or whatever it might be. So these two systems work in opposites when they're stimulating different organs. And that finishes up this section of the lecture. In the next section we're going to look at the brain, and then we'll also look at the spinal cord, the different parts, and how the central nervous system is protected.